like the Clackamas in particular. So we'll go over kind of a general overview of anadromous fish life history, and then we'll get specific to the fish in the Clackamas, and then talk about implications for the restoration work you're doing and project design. You'll probably see a lot of connection between this and the Lower River Habitat Assessment, the projects we identified. We learned a lot. I used my experience as much as I could to, contribute to the work. So you'll see a lot of what's in this presentation in that document as well. So we'll get started. And it's interesting when you talk about fish life history, it's like, where do you start? Do you start at the egg? Do you start at the adult? So basically what I'm going to start with is upstream migration of adult fish. After they've spent their time in the ocean maturing for 1 to 5 years, depending on the population. 1 year for fish that are jacks, they are immature fish that return early. More likely adult fish, adult salmonids, spend 2 to 5 years in the ocean before they mature. And it's that maturation process that gets them to initiate upstream migration. So they've matured, they've grown to their extent, they're beginning to develop gonads, and that means they are ready to spawn. So they start moving upstream. And obviously what they need are no barriers to upstream fish migration, and then cool and pathogen-free water, which is becoming more and more important for adult fish as they encounter warmer than ever water that has more pathogens in it, particularly talking about spring Chinook salmon that go through the Willamette River and experience 70+ degree water in the middle of summer. It's a big issue that those fish didn't run into before because their timing was different than it currently is, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. Spawning, the stage after fish have migrated up to their spawning tributary. Adults do spawn in or near their tributary of origin after they reach full maturity. Meaning the tributary of origin, say it's Eagle Creek, most fish that spawn in Eagle Creek will return and spawn in Eagle Creek, but they may spawn in Deep Creek, they may spawn in the main stem Clackamas, and in a few cases, they may even spawn in something like Johnson Creek or Mount Scott Creek for reasons such as they're late. They arrived late, they've matured to the point that they need to spawn, so they find the most suitable habitat nearby, which may not be their tributary of origin, but fish, when they're juveniles, they imprint on where they came from, which is why most fish do return to somewhere close to where they came from. Their habitat needs suitable substrate for spawning, meaning roughly 1/2 to 2 inch size gravel, low levels of fine sediment. Adult fish like overhead cover nearby, meaning bushes, trees, anything hanging over the stream that can protect them from predators overhead. Even though they're an adult fish, they're still worried about a bird, coming down and getting them from above. So they like logs over the top of them. Suitable water velocity and depth. And that's hard to kind of say what is suitable water velocity and depth, because fish do spawn in anything from 12 inches of water to 6 feet deep of water. It's a matter of having the proper velocity of water to bring oxygen to the eggs that are within a fish's nest or redd. So after spawning, egg incubation. Eggs incubate in the gravel for 90 to 110 days prior to them emerging from the gravel itself. So fish deposit eggs within a redd, up to 18 inches deep. So that fish, or those eggs, need oxygen. They need good water quality that's toxin-free. There's concerns more and more with contaminants from toxins impacting eggs that are developing within a redd. So that becomes an issue for tributaries like, say, Deep Creek. that is more developing, and we may have more potential for toxin impacts, but more likely to impact the more developing watersheds like Johnson, Mount Scott, that have a lot of road network in and around where spawning habitat is located. It's also something to kind of consider for those fish in the Clackamas that need to spawn low in the basin. Chum, fall Chinook tend to be very low in a basin, therefore they're more subject to water quality issues because they receive everything from up above. After egg incubation, and again, that's a really important stage because many people don't realize that those eggs are in the gravel for that long before a fish becomes able to swim freely. So fry emerge from the gravel and become free swimming. After that 90 to 110 days, they are very, very small, half the length of your pinky. They need cover, wood, boulders, undercut banks. They need good water quality. Temperature in early summer, in particular for winter steelhead, is critical. Those fish that emerge, say as late as July, and I'll get into the specifics again later, are already experiencing temperatures nowadays that are exceeding 60, 65 degrees, even into 70. The year that we had, I think it was 2015, when temperatures got into the 80s in the Willamette, some tributary temperatures were already into the 70s. So that's something to consider, in particular for winter steelhead that spawn late in the spring, therefore they tend to emerge from the gravel later. Another thing about most salmon that spawn in the fall, they emerge from the gravel in winter, late fall, winter, when flows get really high. So those fish are not very capable of swimming against high flows like that. So they're oftentimes swept downstream away from where they originated. And oftentimes this is fish from the upper basin, tributaries like Eagle Creek, Deep Creek, Clear Creek, and they end up in the lower basin where they then have to rear to prepare themselves for ocean migration. It's kind of a life history strategy that biologists undervalued in some cases because very little fish fry tend to die easily. So their mortality rate is very, very high compared to older age fish that have grown to some size. So there was some idea that those fry that were swept downstream were lost to a population. But what we find more often than not is those fish are brought down to habitat that in many cases is more suitable for rearing than where they were born, because say, for example, in the Clackamas gets very, very cold. So the lower basin can be warmer in the middle of winter than the upper basin. Therefore, those fish have a better ability to grow when the water is warmer, as opposed to middle of winter when it can actually get down to about 35 degrees in the Clackamas. Winter rearing. Juvenile fish seek off-channel habitats to escape impacts from high winter flows. Those floods, the flooding events that bring high fine sediment loads, those fish are margin oriented and looking for habitat off of the main stem so they can get away from the impacts of those high flows. So their needs are access to that off-channel habitat, a diversity of off-channel habitats that includes backwaters, slack or slow water pools, beaver ponds, but also includes flowing side channels that are from very small size to almost secondary channels of the river, where you'll find fish, again, escaping those high flows. They need cover, they need wood, boulder, and cobble. Thinking of boulder and cobble as habitat, a lot of Chinook, in particular steelhead, use that cobble and boulder habitat to hide during those high flow events. They tend to be more mainstream oriented, steelhead and Chinook, where Coho are very off-channel oriented, and we'll get into that again a little better. And then a buffer from those very cold winter temperatures. They're looking for winter habitat that's not 35 degrees. They'd much rather have 55 degrees where they can actually grow when they do feed and find forage food. Summer rearing, that's juvenile fish seeking cool, cold water habitats to forage and grow. Summer rearing is the most critical stage for fish because it oftentimes determines their success in subsequent life stages. We'll kind of get into that later. And again, their habitat needs are access to off-shell habitat, complex margin habitat, and very much so cool water refugia. And I'm kind of differentiating between cold water refugia and cool water refugia because it only has to be cool enough. It doesn't have to be necessarily cold, like 55 degrees in the middle of summer. That's not what fish, they do need it, but that's not necessarily what they're always used to. So temperatures in the 60s are fine, mid 60s are okay. You get into the upper 60s and 70s, that's when water temperature really begins to impact a fish's ability to grow. Because water temperature gets higher, their metabolic rate increases, they can't get enough food to adequately, feed their growth rate. So it's a challenge for them just because they can't find off-channel cold water refugia. Oh, sorry.
Hey Todd, can I ask you a question?
You bet.
Or are we waiting till the end? Okay. No. I may have heard this wrong, but I'm not sure. So it seems like temperatures used to be in the range, the low temperatures, meaning the cool temperatures, and now we've got water temperatures that are dropping way down. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, no, it's not that it's abnormally cold. It's just that the Clackamas is a very, very cold river in winter. Therefore, it's counterintuitive that they need warmer water in order to effectively grow during winter months. So off-channel habitats, they provide that warmer water buffer. Say like the Parsons side channel we know is about 55 degrees in the middle of winter. So the fish that are in there, which are primarily coho, will do just fine rearing in that as opposed to say Chinook or Steelhead that are forced to rear in much colder water. Now, it again, it's not that it's abnormally cold. The issue with water temperature is obviously the reverse of when it gets too warm, it really impacts their growth rate by growing too fast, kind of, needing to forage where if the forage isn't available, they're then not going to grow like they're supposed to.
Got it. Thanks.
Okay. So smolt migration, after these fish grow to a certain size, which basically metabolically they change. They start to, basically their body prepares for ocean entry. They change color. They start to, their internal organs start to prepare for saltwater, the shift from fresh to saltwater. That basically is their cue to start moving downstream and head to the ocean, where they then will grow and mature for 1 to 5 years. Smolt migration downstream, also it needs to be barrier free. That's not necessarily the case in the Clackamas because downstream migration is impacted by the dams. Not so much now because PGE has done quite a bit to the project to allow fish to move down when they want to, which is now becoming evident as fish move downstream in late fall and winter and end up in the lower basin. More fish than they ever knew did that before, which is making, this is my, kind of press to say the lower river habitat is much more important than it ever was before because there's more fish coming down that are immature and they need that habitat to grow. We saw the fish that went into Tryon Creek and then ended up at North Fork. It's exactly those fish that got swept out of the Clackamas and ended up rearing in a different environment, either the Willamette, and then they were forced out of the Willamette into Tryon to get into cooler water. It's a very interesting life history that we'll talk about a little bit later, but that's what happens in smolt migration is those fish, they still have time to rear. Even there's migrations that occur downstream that aren't necessarily when fish are smolts. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit later. Ocean entry and growth. Juvenile fish enter the ocean and forage heavily for growth and development. What they need is a cool and productive ocean, and then the timing of upwelling to coincide with when they enter the ocean. This is another thing that's changing because of the life history pattern of fish and then the patterns of flows in our basins. Fish are not entering the ocean at the time when it's most rich. Fish used to be almost cued directly to migrate to the ocean when say late spring storms start to, actually I think it's more warming begins to create upwelling in the ocean near shore. That's something that the timing is off now. So as well as ocean productivity typically being low, it very much impacts the ability of our juvenile fish to grow, survive, and it's outside of our hands kind of because we can't really restore that habitat, but that's the habitat that's obviously being impacted most by our climate change issues. And we won't really get into much about how much ocean really determines the productivity of a population, but what we're doing in the basin of origin, say, is we are making sure that those fish are fit enough, they're healthy enough once they enter the ocean that even though the ocean productivity might be down, those fish can still be successful.
So, Todd, I have a question. So you would say that the greatest challenge posed by climate change to salmon populations is the timing of ocean upwelling and migration?
That's one of them. Really, it is ocean productivity in general, that a real small change in ocean productivity can have a huge impact on the number of adult fish that we have coming back to the Clackamas. It can be as small as a 0.5 degree change in water temperature that really will dictate, whether we get 1% of the smolts that go out surviving, or say 5% of the smolts going out surviving. And when you're talking about thousands of smolts, that difference in 1 to 5% is huge. We can't make that much of an impact in the freshwater environment to say dictate that much of a life history difference. But what we are doing is making sure that those fish, again, when they are getting to the ocean, they're bigger, fatter, in general, more healthy to survive that less hospitable ocean, I guess you could say.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Todd, I had a question, or
Sure.
kind of something that I've heard is something to the effect that the smolts, as they're migrating out, have some trouble navigating in the reservoirs that are created behind the power dams, and that it used to be this nice flowing water that would help carry them because they're not as strong as the adult fish, and that now they're getting stuck in this stagnant water that some of them don't have enough power to get through. Is there something you could say to that?
Yeah, it's much more of an issue for the large reservoirs on the Columbia hydro system, where instead of being, in a flood flow on the Columbia really swept fish downstream, versus now the series of dams being, still at high flows, being very low velocity. The fish need to swim hard to make it, versus high flows just sweeping them down as they normally would. So the series of reservoirs in the Columbia Basin being, good at attenuating floods for, those of us that live downstream, they really impact downstream migration. Now that the dams in the Clackamas, say, they do have an impact. It's a little bit different though, because what happens with fish when they enter, say, like North Fork Reservoir, is they find a suitable habitat. it's not that bad in the middle of winter for a fish to rear in that reservoir environment because it's productive. So a lot of fish in the past would stay there. They would grow very big and actually be pretty productive. So and these were coho oftentimes. It was hard to say that that's a better situation for those fish, that we want those fish to stay in the reservoir. So what was proposed and what actually happened is that PGE put the juvenile fish collector in, that instead of fish coming up to the dam and milling around oftentimes, the juvenile collector collects those fish and moves them downstream like they would normally go. So timing is impacted in the Clackamas, but not as much so that it really impacts, I think, the life history of fish. It was more upstream migration of adults at those dams that had an impact, not so much the downstream migration timing. But you're right, the Columbia is very much that issue. The Willamette is somewhat of that issue, that peak winter flows that would normally sweep Clackamas fish out into the ocean, downstream into the Columbia, they're not happening like they used to. So that does impact the timing of fish entering the ocean, which is typically, I think, later now, more July than it is June. So that's a good question.
Interesting. Thank you. Is that just one follow-up? Is that collector that you're speaking about, is that a machine or is that a person?
It's a machine. It's a big machine. It costs probably $30 million, I think. They might say it costs more than that, but it takes in, I think, 1,500 cubic feet per second of water, draws it through a collection device, screens out the fish, and then those fish are put into a tube and actually diverted all the way around the 13-mile project reach. It might be interesting for you guys to, at some point, have PG take you on a tour of it, because it's a really interesting system to see.
Yes, very good,
cool.
Todd. Thanks for covering the mechanics of that assist the fish migration both up and down stream. And that is the opportunity to visit the facility may come available following the current wildfire issue and all the hazards that are up there.
Yeah.
We have gone there in the past. So new staff would be good to see it, as well as the sorter that has the button and divert hatchery fish out of the system.
Yep.
I'd find that really interesting.
Yeah, thank you.
Todd, so you said that the juvenile bypass sends fish around the 13-mile project reach, so
Yep.
it captures them upstream of even the most upstream reservoir?
Yeah, it captures them, well, no, it captures them at North Fork. So I guess it wouldn't be 13 miles, it would be less the North Fork Reservoir. It takes them from North Fork Reservoir and then dumps them down below Rivermill.
Okay, so North Fork Reservoir at the dam?
Yep.
Okay, wow.
And what used to happen is the method of those fish going downstream would be either through the fish ladder, which there are otters and things like that that predate upon fish through the fish ladder. They could go through the turbines, which is not the best survival route, but roughly 60 to 80% of the fish that do go through the turbines survive. The other route would be high flows in the winter over the dam, which is a very, very low survival route for fish because they oftentimes crash on a rock shelf below the dam. So we'll get into specific life histories, and we'll talk about winter steelhead. And I'm only going to go through kind of the interesting life history traits of fish that kind of impact what you are doing. With Clackamas winter steelhead, upstream migration occurs from January through April. Spawning can start as late February, but it's typically March with a peak in April. And we will see winter steelhead that will spawn as late as May. but it's typically in the colder reaches of the upper Clackamas, where the water is so cold that those fish don't spawn until it starts to warm up. Egg incubation can occur from March through July. And that's an important one because we do have winter steelhead that spawn throughout the main stem river, lower main stem, BB Island, one of the potential project sites. There's a reach where we have pretty dense spawning of winter steelhead, and those fish would be subject to incredibly warm temperatures, or not incredibly warm, but potentially too warm of temperature when they emerge in early July. So that's a population to consider, needs that cold water refugia in the lower main stem, probably most importantly. Fry emergence, again, up through July. Winter rearing for steelhead is as much as 2-3 winters long. Summer rearing can be 2 to 3 summers long, meaning steelhead will rear in a freshwater environment for 2 or 3 years prior to actually migrating out to the ocean. Most often in the lower basin, since it's warmer, smolts or steelhead smolts emigrate as 2-year-olds. In the much colder upper basin of the watershed, it may take 3 years for those fish to grow enough to gain size that they're ready to go to the ocean. So smolt migration is almost exclusively occurs in spring with high flows that help to assist fish to move downstream and reach the ocean in that June time period. If fish don't, one problem with fish entering the lower river, say the Willamette or Columbia later, is that as the water's warm now, they're more pathogen rich. So say in the past where pathogens weren't an issue until July or August, pathogens can become an issue as early as June when temperatures reach into the 70s. So it's something to consider for these fish migrating out, that if they aren't out of the system early enough, they can be subject to higher pathogen loads outside of the Clackamas Basin. The rearing habitat, the box off to the side kind of explains the primary rearing habitat for winter steelhead. It's main and secondary channel margins. Complex habitats, again, say wood, boulders, rocks, deep pools and overhead cover. What you don't see here is typically off-channel habitat, because steelhead are not often found, say, in beaver ponds, alcoves, slack waters where coho tend to dominate. So winter steelhead are very segregated from other salmonids in their rearing preference. They like, say, secondary channels where I think what they found was 30 to 80 CFS of water was ideal for main stem rearing habitat. When you got bigger than that, they tend to be less dense. So moving to a very different fish life history with coho, and this is there's 2 coho populations in the Clackamas that act very differently. There's an early coho run that migrates upstream and starting in August, as early as, I think they've seen them at North Fork as early as August 15th through October. They spawn October and November. Egg incubation is October through January. So again, this is a time period when we have pretty high flooding flows in the Clackamas. You typically see the highest flows in January and February. Sometimes we'll see very high flow events in December, but more often they're later in midwinter. So these fish tend to spawn in areas that aren't subject to the issues of high flows. So they're more dominant in tributaries where, say like Eagle Creek, Clear Creek, Deep Creek, we tend not to find coho spawning in main stem river habitat. They tend to reach up into the tributaries where they'll spawn. But those also are areas where they don't have a lot of rearing habitat that's off channel. say like Deep Creek, even Clear Creek, there isn't really a lot of floodplain habitat for the fish that do go up and spawn there. So there's some limit to the number of coho that those tributaries can actually produce simply by the amount of habitat that's available in them. Where we see lower gradient habitat, and actually going back to Deep Creek, because Deep Creek does have some very low gradient areas where it is perfect coho rearing habitat. But it's also the lower basin where we have the floodplain connections, we have low gradient, beaver complexes, side channels that have slack water. Those are the places that these coho will tend to rear. And that's, again, I think the biggest focus or the biggest benefit uplift that can be gained from the actions that you guys are proposing are probably going to be for coho. Let's see, where did I stop? Winter rearing, they spend 2 winters. So they'll be the first winter after spawning, 1 summer, and then after their second winter, they're ready to migrate out to the ocean. So that's 18 months of rearing within the freshwater environment. Compared to steelhead, again, that might be 2 or 3 years. It's one of the reasons why I think steelhead are more subject to the impacts from water quality than others, because they simply spend more time in freshwater rearing environment. Smolt migration, same timing, March through May, again, to try to find that ocean upwelling in time. Their preferred rearing habitat, off-channel, complex habitats, beaver ponds, alcoves, slack water, basically where you have no or low velocity and deep enough pools, you'll find coho. And coho tend to dominate. They outcompete other fish. Basically, they're aggressive to the point that they push other salmonids, steelhead, and Chinook out of their preferred rearing habitats. So those Chinook and steelhead are then left with the more main channel habitats to rear in. That's kind of how they compartmentalize, I guess, rearing habitats for fish. Lake coho. Lake coho, very different than early coho in that they start upstream migration in October and go through January. They tend to spawn in different locations of the basin. They do spawn in Clear Creek. We found them in Clear, we found them in Eagle, and they're spawning as late as February, which is very interesting for coho because, and it's unique, there aren't many coho populations throughout the Pacific Northwest that actually spawn that late. Egg incubation is October through April, through the peak of winter. Fry emergence is January through May. And winter rearing, same as early coho, they spend 2 winters, 1 summer, with smolt migration in March and May. Spring Chinook. Upstream migration can start as early as February of a year and extend all the way through September. So spring Chinook are entering, say, the Willamette River as early as February, but they may be entering as late as the middle of summer now. And it's in large part because of a shift in run timing for spring Chinook that moves them later and later and later. I won't go into it too much, but some of that influence is from the dams. Upstream migration into the upper basin has been delayed. Prior to Rivermill Dam's fish ladder being replaced, fish oftentimes would wait below the ladder for water temperatures to cool before they would actually move upstream. And those fish were forced to stay below the dam in suboptimal temperature water. They would get diseased. They would arrive at their spawning areas late. So progressively, since the ladder was basically built back in the 20s, the spring Chinook run went later and later and later as a result. Commercial fishing and sport fishing impacts also impacted run timing. Hatchery fish production also impacted timing, but most importantly, it was that dam and the fish ladder that has been replaced. And now fish are able to effectively navigate the ladder quickly on time. And you're seeing what PGE is seeing is a rapid shift in run timing back to what is more typical for these fish, that they are seeing upstream migration in as early as March. And what the most interesting thing is they're starting to see spawning even earlier and earlier, which is important again for those fish to spawn at the right time so they develop to the right point before winter. And these fish are almost exclusively upper basin spawners, that if they're spawning too late, then they're impacted more by high winter flows. So now they're moving back to their normal run timing, which is more like late August to September for spawning. So egg incubation is September through November before those high flows occur. Fry emergence, December, February. These fish are similar to Coho. They spend 2 winters rearing. They look for off-channel complex habitats during their first winter, because these fish are very, very small, and similar to Coho, they're kind of swept into off-channel rearing areas. They look for margins of secondary main channels, deep pools in particular, cover, and coarse substrate. And for those of you that know the difference between stream type and ocean type rearing for Chinook, these spring Chinook are stream type rearers. So they spend 18 months rearing within the stream of origin before they emigrate to the ocean. For summer rearing, they're looking for margins of the secondary main channels, deep pools, cover, and coarse substrate again. You'll find Chinook in and amongst gravel. That's where they'll hide, as opposed to, rearing in a deep pool, under a log or something like that. They're more reclusive. Steelhead are almost loners in a sense. You'll oftentimes not find more than one steelhead in a particular rearing habitat, versus Coho that you might find 100 in the same pool. So it's very different how these fish kind of segregate themselves within rearing habitats. And it's something that, if we have time, we can get into a little bit later. I didn't go into fall Chinook and Chum too extensively because they don't have a very extended life history in the Clackamas. Clackamas fall Chinook salmon, they're also not doing very well. We could say that the population is, I wouldn't say functionally extinct, but there's less than 300 adults, which does kind of mean that it's functionally extinct. There's one location in the basin that we know that they spawn densely, and that's in McIver Park, right upstream from the PG side channel entrance. That doesn't mean that these fish wouldn't spawn in other suitable locations of the lower basin. And I think some of the actions that you can take and will take would provide rearing habitat for these fish, which they may spend 4 months in their tributary of origin before they go to the estuary and near shore. So fall Chinook are ocean type rearers, where they spend 3 or 4 months maybe in their tributary of origin, but the majority of their rearing life history is spent closer to the ocean. So these fish are more obligate to habitats outside of the Clackamas. That might be the lower Willamette. It might be the lower Columbia from the mouth of the Willamette down to Astoria. And the same goes for chum salmon, which are almost exclusively estuarine rearing. So say Clackamas chum historically spawned in November and December, those fish would almost immediately move down to the Willamette to rear for up to 9 months before they then migrate to the ocean near shore. So Clackamas chum, one of the reasons that they're extirpated is that they are almost exclusively obligate to a habitat that for years and years was toxic to rearing fish. So, and that was the lower Willamette. So it's no doubt that those fish, no longer exist, but some of that has changed. Not that the complexity of rearing habitat is there, the toxicity of it is no longer there. So there are considerations for reintroducing chum. The Clackamas would be a location that they would consider chum reintroduction. Chum would most likely spawn in the very lower reaches of tributaries like Lower Clear, Lower Deep, Lower Eagle. Eagle Creek has a barrier about a mile upstream that only Steelhead and Coho can navigate. They would also spawn in the areas where we find winter steelhead spawning main stem. So Lower Clear Creek is one that's very interesting because we do have a project proposed there. Metro has done a significant amount of work in the lower 2 to 3 miles. What I've kind of put kind of a bug in the head of the chum reintroduction coordinator is, here's a perfect opportunity. And what they will look for is making sure that the habitat needs are met for those fish before they consider something like reintroduction. But Clear Creek could very well be a location where reintroduction may occur in the future. So it's something to consider, something to keep in mind. So our implications for restoration planning and project design. Summer rearing habitat is a critically important life stage for salmon and steelhead. The water temperature and access to cool water refugia can dictate the size of fish, and size is all about fitness. How fit is that fish to survive once it moves downstream, encounters predators, encounters the ocean, and ocean predators. Again, it's all about growing big. Foraging ability is related to complexity of rearing habitat. How much riparian cover is there? How much in-stream cover is there from wood? What's the substrate quality? Again, boulders, cobble is very important. And this all leads to aquatic insect production. What kind of production does occur in rearing habitats where those fish are looking to forage to grow big? This gets at the macroinvertebrate monitoring at the project sites. There's the connection, is that the quality of insects in those rearing habitats can oftentimes dictate how those fish will do in that rearing habitat. So hopefully we will be able to detect changes that then can be inferred that that's going to benefit those fish that are growing there. Winter rearing habitat is important too, and it's related to access to off-channel habitats for escape from high winter flows and the increased fine sediment load that goes with those flows. Water temperature profile of off-channel habitats during winter is oftentimes warmer, and it gets back to hyperrheic and groundwater flows are often in that 55-degree range of what groundwater oftentimes is, compared to a wintertime river temperature in the Clackamas that can be as cold as 33 degrees. We've even had anchor ice form, in the Clackamas River before. So it's a very cold river, and that's very challenging for fish to get growth during winter months. So accessing habitats that are warmer is very important for those fish. And you do get in side channel and off channel areas, whether it's hyperrheic flow or groundwater flow from seepage along the banks, those are what contributes to the warming of those off-channel areas. And that provides the ability of fish to forage even when main stem river temperatures are very, very low. Something to consider are changes to life history resulting from climate change. We talked about this a little bit, the run timing of fish that has shifted, to later. I don't think of timing necessarily changing to earlier, but run timing affects spawn timing, affects egg incubation. They all shift accordingly. So fish historically were timed to kind of deal with the conditions when they were rearing. When that changes, they have a difficult time adapting to that change. That being said, salmonids are incredibly plastic, and they do have the ability to make changes in their rearing life history. It's just how much can they adapt to. I think we still haven't quite seen. Metabolic rate increases with warming temperature, very important. 55-degree water is ideal. When it gets warmer, metabolic rate increases, so that's where biologists will say 65 degrees isn't good for fish. It's not that bad. As long as fish can have access to cooler water, you have diurnal fluctuation where the water cools at night. Salmonids are out, they're used to these kinds of changes in water temperature, and they can adapt. There's been really interesting study on fish or trout in Montana and in the Yellowstone, where they've adapted to temperatures related to, I think, either geysers or things adjacent to the river where the water has warmed rapidly. Those fish have changed their life history to adapt to that. Not that it's good, but it's hopefully something fish can deal with until we get a change in climate. Access to high quality off-channel habitats become more and more critical as climate continues to warm. That's a straightforward one. All right, so a restoration strategy, and this is something I put together quickly at the end, and it is based a lot on the work that we did in the Lower River Habitat Assessment. Restoration of partially functioning rearing habitats that currently support some level of juvenile fish use. So what I'm saying here is that we're not creating everything from scratch. There has to be, some use, some habitat. And part of this is we simply don't, and you guys know this better than anybody, we simply don't have enough money to restore everything. But restoring those that are partially functioning allows us to see what is currently functioning, whether it's good or bad. It's something that we can improve on. The second would be to reactivate disengaged floodplain habitats that no longer provide summer or winter rearing potential. This gets at more of the creation, not so much through digging a side channel, but doing or getting back what the river is lost, which is its ability to occupy the floodplain on a relatively routine pattern in winter months. The river has become more often a single thread where fish simply don't do as well when all of the water is going through one channel. There isn't as much complexity. When you have off-channel habitats, that's where you get complexity that fish can then utilize a variety of different habitats. We want to obviously, and this is the obvious one, identify, restore, and protect cool water refugia in the lower Clackamas River. One thing we really haven't done is a lot of identification of that cool water refugia. It may be something to consider as you look at future projects is it cool? Can it be cooler? Can you do things to increase that amount of refugia habitat that if the water temperature does get into the 70s more often in the lower Clackamas, they still have access to something cooler, something 65, something maybe lower 60s, not just in that 70-degree range where fish, 73 to 75 is when you start talking lethal temperature range. So we're not quite there yet, but the Clackamas does get into the 70s in the lower parts of the basin in late July, early August sometimes.
Todd, I have a question. Is that a time when they can release water from the underside of the reservoir or something like that to counter that? And is that a mechanism that they employ?
Yeah, unfortunately, the reservoirs in the Clackamas don't stratify like the big reservoirs in the Columbia or other reservoirs do. Plus, they're not really storage reservoirs, so they don't have storage ability to release. It's all about power production in this system. So unfortunately, no, but what PGE has done is they've tried to increase the rate at which water flows through their project. So it doesn't have as much time to warm. They got rid of Faraday Lake. or modified it where instead of it being an open reservoir, it's kind of a flume that conveys the water much more quickly. And it did prove to cool the water. I think it was 0.3 of a degree Celsius versus what it used to be. But yeah, it's unfortunate they don't really have that ability in the Clackamas.
Was that project designed, that transferring it from a lake to a flume, specifically for water temperature?
Yep, it was an action that PG had in their FERC license, their new FERC license.
And was 0.3 of a degree Celsius the target, or was that just, it was? Okay.
Good question. Actually, I think what they determined the impact from the reservoirs at peak summer temperatures was 1.5 degrees Celsius. So their goal was to reduce temperatures that much. That project, I think it was determined 0.3 of a degree. The other projects are shade our streams, I think is support from PGE to help to reduce temperatures that way. Their gravel augmentation program is another one that is hopefully going to reduce temperatures through increasing, hyperrate flows through gravel that is not as present in the upper reaches because of the dams. That's more of a minute kind of site-specific reduction in temperatures as opposed to more, along the entire route of the Clackamas. But that is where we can create habitat that can and should be cooler if we have flows through groundwater areas.
Are there other strategies that are being considered to control temperature, especially as temperature will continue to rise and we'll need to counter that more, like underground reservoirs that could be released in the hot times, or like albedo effect covering of parts of the river or something?
Well, good question. I think, in-ground storage or infiltration of water through alluvium is maybe the option, but I don't know what we're looking into in the basin from that larger watershed perspective. And Liz, I don't know if you or Cheryl have been involved in anything like that, but it certainly would be something that even the water providers are going to be wanting to look at, is how do we try to cool this river? And are there any of those large scale opportunities available, where you could do, in-ground storage of water that, even on a small scale, instead of, storing water in an above ground reservoir, store it below ground where it doesn't warm so much. And this would be through the tributaries, where even Deep Creek, Eagle Creek, where you have a lot of agricultural use, we're reducing the amount of flows in the middle of summer that is just allows that water to increase more rapidly. So I think our best opportunity might be some of those small opportunities to get cooling of water in tributaries that just isn't being looked at right now. And I don't know if you guys know any more, Liz or Cheryl, if there are, but I think that could be something to look at from a kind of planning perspective, is what are our actions going to be after we try to restore the in-stream habitat? So that's a great question.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There are different programs that are, like, especially in Central and Southern California, that are investigating how you might deal with these temperature issues. I know that it's really difficult to cool down water, so keeping it cool from the source is a really focused on approach as compared to trying to cool it down further down in the system. So things, like planting the riparian up high and like in the system so it doesn't get warm in the first place, and focusing efforts up there. But it's interesting.
I think the Kim Swan with the Clackamas River Water Providers has sought out funding to do some assessments and identify opportunities for the future. So Susie participates with Kim Swan in the Clackamas Technical Working Group, and that will likely bring out some opportunities as well as the current planning for the Clackamas River Conference that has water quality component to that. But very good suggestions, Todd, and good question, Adam.
Thank you.
So next, a couple of considerations. One is considering the populations that are needing the greatest uplift and target restoration actions at specific life history stages. And talking about, I wouldn't say Coho, Chinook, and Steelhead are doing great. They're actually on an increasing trajectory in the basin. So there's some good things that are happening with those populations. Fall Chinook, Chum, and bull trout being a little different because they're currently being reintroduced. They're all at a stage where they either have winked out or they could very well wink out soon. So there's something to be said about having a role in protecting a population from extinction, or recovering it from that kind of extinct, extirpated, whatever you want to call it, situation that they're in. Fall Chinook were certainly a population that was abundant in the Clackamas, and I think many people may deny that, but part of the fact is the dams likely impacted a significant amount of fall Chinook spawning habitat because the dams are located in the transition between low gradient and the higher gradient upper basin, and those tend to be areas where fall Chinook populations dominate. Lower Clear Creek, lower Eagle Creek, maybe not so much lower Deep Creek, but the main stem from River Mill down can provide, and again, this reach in McIver, it has almost all of the fall Chinook spawning that occurs in November, basically, where other fall Chinook populations, say what they consider two-leaf fall Chinook, are much earlier spawning fish. They spawn in September. And that's just not the population that historically occupied the Clackamas because it was too warm even historically in the Clackamas for main stem spawning fish. Fall Chinook is again, it's one of those populations that I think is an opportunity for the Watershed Council to potentially be a lead in their recovery. And that's something that you could also consider for Chum. And I talked about it a little bit earlier, is the restoration of Clear Creek. Metro has done a lot of work. We have a project proposed, although it is within and near Carver Park. There's certainly some benefits to be derived from doing actions there for a population that is considered extirpated, but could and very well should be attempted to be reintroduced. We also want to consider the populations that rear outside of the Clackamas Basin for some or all of their rearing life history. And that would be Coho, the Coho that we found rearing in Tryon Creek. I'm sure that wasn't the only one that was doing that. It has to be that a lot of the fish that move down from the upper basin, what tends to happen is that they'll occupy habitat. Once that habitat is full, meaning it's reached its capacity, the next fish has to move downstream to the next suitable habitat. And oftentimes that could be the lower Willamette Basin. So support of those projects outside of the Clackamas Basin are going to, and I'm not saying that, by any means CRBC doesn't, because you do, but it may be even more so that we find ways to ensure that NICUIC can implement those actions in the lower Willamette that are going to support your populations as much as the actions you do within the basin. Well, Spring Chinook do the same thing Coho do. Life history, those fish do go down to the Willamette and spend up to that year rearing. The thing is, the difference is the Willamette rearing habitat in the middle of winter is 55 degrees versus the Clackamas being much, much colder. So that's a life history strategy that historically, used to use Portland Harbor as its rearing nursery. No longer has that now. Then continue to investigate options for spawning and rearing habitat in lower basin tributaries. It's one thing that I haven't talked to you guys, the council, about is what you are doing to look at actions outside of the lower main stem. You know, there are opportunities out there. It's just making sure that we're still keeping an eye on those tributary actions that you can as well look at in the future. So I think that's all I have.